Welcome to Suthichai Live English. The catastrophic flooding of Hat Yai, southern Thailand this year was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was a predictable failure of governance. The rain may have been extraordinary, but the consequences were not. Anyone who has followed Thailand's long history of water crises, from the south's seasonal floods to the central plains' recurrent inundations, could see this one coming. And yet, when the waters rose, the country once again found itself scrambling, confused, and tragically unprepared. It is time we admit a difficult truth, inconvenient truth, and that is Thailand does not suffer from a lack of warnings. It suffers from a lack of readiness. So, what are the essential lessons from the Hat Yai's devastation? Lessons drawn not only from this week's crisis, but also from painful precedents in the region, including the hard-earned experience from disasters such as the hurricane in the US in 2005, and that was Hurricane Katrina, or Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and Thailand's own 2004 tsunami. Unless these lessons translate into long-term reform, the next flood will only repeat the same mistakes. Let's get Ping to give us that analysis, how Thailand must, this time, change course and take reform seriously. Hi, Ping.
You know, when a city like Hat Yai gets hit with catastrophic floods, our first instinct is to call it a natural disaster, an act of God, right? But what if that's not the whole story? What if it was something else entirely, something that was actually predictable and maybe even preventable? We're going to break down exactly how this predictable disaster was allowed to happen.
And this really gets to the core of what we're unpacking here. The source material is, well, pretty blunt about it. It says the rain might have been from nature, sure, but the catastrophe that followed, that was a man-made failure. This wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of bad policy.
And that's really the heart of the problem, isn't it? See, for years, Thailand has had access to forecasts, data, all the warnings you could ask for. But here's the kicker. Having a warning and actually being ready to act on it, they're two totally different things. And that gap, well, that's exactly where this tragedy unfolded.
Okay, so to really get our heads around what went so wrong, we're going to break it all down into 5 key lessons. And these aren't just about Hat Yai, you know? They're about how any government can fail its people in a crisis if its systems just aren't built for the real world. Let's start at the top, with the chain of command.
Just look at this. It shows the fundamental mismatch that crippled the whole response. In a flood, you need decisions made in minutes. But the system? It was designed for orders to trickle down all the way from Bangkok, which is hundreds of kilometers away. The result? Hours of delay. You had local leaders just waiting for the call, totally unsure if they had the authority to act, all while the water was rising. Instead of providing clarity, this top-down command structure just created more confusion. All right, the second major failure was all about communication. And really, it's a classic problem, right? You can have mountains of data, but it's completely useless if it doesn't translate into clear, simple guidance for people on the ground. There's a huge, huge difference between raw information and what we call actionable intelligence. And get this, this was a real warning that went out. It perfectly shows the problem. Just think about it. Heavy rain is expected in the south. Okay, so what am I supposed to do with that information? It's so vague, so broad, it does absolutely nothing to tell me if I personally am in immediate danger. So that begs the question, right? If you're at home, maybe you're watching the news, and you hear the waters rising, what information is actually life or death in that moment? It's definitely not a generic weather forecast. No, people needed to know this stuff. Is my neighborhood going to flood? Where's the closest shelter? And how do I even get there safely? Should I leave right now or do I have a few hours? And just how high is the water going to get? Like, do I need to put valuables on a table or do I literally need to get on my roof? This is the kind of specific, precise information that saves lives. And it was just completely missing. And this number is just staggering. Think about it. Over 90% of people in the flood zone got an alert on their phones. So the system to reach people, it worked perfectly. But the message itself, it was a total failure. A warning that doesn't make you do the right thing is basically just noise. It got to their phones, but it never really reached their minds. Which brings us to a really crucial point. You know, it's so easy to sit back and blame the public for not evacuating or for not being prepared, but this quote, it completely reframes the entire issue. If the public doesn't know what to do, that's not on them. That's a failure of the government that was supposed to prepare and train them in the first place. So what does that failure actually look like on the ground? Well, it means there were no community evacuation drills to build that crucial muscle memory, no clearly marked signs pointing you to a shelter, no shared maps that everyone could look at to see which areas were most at risk. I mean, you look at countries like Japan, and this whole culture of preparedness is baked into society. It's built through constant practice. Here, it felt like an afterthought. And finally, we have to talk about the physical reality of the city itself. Because really, Hat Yai had basically built itself into a flood trap. For years, you had all this unregulated construction just paving over wetlands, blocking natural waterways, all the places water is supposed to go. So the city became this giant concrete basin. And when the man-made drains were overwhelmed, there was simply nowhere else for the water to go.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time diagnosing the failures. But what's the solution? How do we fix this? Well, the source material actually lays out a super clear path forward. And these aren't just, suggestions. These are 6 non-negotiable reforms to build a system that's actually ready for the next crisis.
And this roadmap really shows you how all the different pieces have to connect. It starts with decentralizing command, right? And building a warning system people can actually trust. But it goes way beyond that. It includes preparing the public through drills and practice, and integrating urban planning with water management. This is a complete overhaul, from the top of the command structure all the way down to community healing. So the really crucial thing here is the shift in mindset. It's all about moving from the old system, where Bangkok tries to micromanage everything and sends out these useless, vague alerts, to a new system, where Bangkok provides the overall strategy, but the local governors are empowered to be the frontline commanders. It's about shifting from urban growth that makes things worse to planning that actively protects floodways. It's a fundamental shift from chaos to command. And all of this really brings us to the final choice. This isn't just about recovering from one flood. It's about deciding what the future is going to look like. Because one thing is for sure, this threat is not going away. And let's be crystal clear about this. The stakes are only getting higher. Climate change means more intense storms, more dangerous floods. That's not a possibility anymore. It's a certainty. The Hat Yai flood wasn't some freak one-time event. It was a preview of the new normal. The source material puts it in these simple, almost chilling terms. The water will return. There's no ambiguity there. It's not a question of if, but when. The forces of nature that caused this flood are guaranteed to show up again. And so, that leaves us with this one final critical question. The lessons they've been learned, and they were paid for at a truly tragic cost. The roadmap for how to fix this is clear. So the choice now is, well, it's between repeating the exact same fatal mistakes all over again, or finally building a system that's truly ready for when the water returns.
Thank you very much, Ping. So, let's sum it up. What Thailand must do to prevent another disaster. That is, number 1, centralized command slows down local action. So one of the greatest failures in Hat Yai was the continued reliance on hyper-centralized decision-making. When disaster struck, Hat Yai waited for signals from Bangkok, precisely when decisions needed to be made locally in minutes, not hours. Under Thailand's emergency laws, the National Water Committee and the Prime Minister, or designated deputy, serve as a central commander. In theory, that should guarantee unified national direction, right? In practice, though, it slows down responses to local conditions. In Hat Yai, local leaders did not activate a full emergency operation center. Local governments, unsure of their authority, waited for national orders. And when Bangkok intervened, it sent multiple teams, each with overlapping responsibilities and inconsistent instructions, adding confusion rather than clarity. A disaster is not the moment to figure out who is in charge. The chain of command must be clear before the storm arrives. Number two, fragmented information leads to fragmented action. That is very clear. Early warnings were issued, but they were vague, broad, and ultimately not actionable. Agencies like the National Water Authority and Meteorological Department had data, but coordination was weak. Warnings stated that heavy rain is expected in the south between certain dates, hardly the specificity needed for local preparation. This gap mirrors failures seen during disasters like Hurricane Katrina, when inaccurate and delayed assessments compounded the human toll. Information that is technically available is useless if it does not translate into clear predictions, risk assessments, and guidance. Hat Yai authorities undermined risk because previous floods drained quickly. No one expected the city to drown so rapidly, and no one told them they should. Number three, the warning system reached phones but not minds. Thailand's cell broadcast system succeeded in one sense. Over 90% of the people received alerts, but the content of those alerts failed to move the public. The messages said, "Move belongings up high." Another message said, "Prepare to evacuate." These were not warnings, they were vague suggestions at best. What people needed was precision. Which neighborhoods should evacuate? Where should they go? When? Which roads were safe? How high would water rise? Compare this to the structured, tiered warning system developed after Typhoon Haiyan, where coded alerts mapped evacuation zones and step-by-step instructions saved lives in later storms. Thailand can adopt similar clarity. When warnings do not guide action, they fail, even if every phone in the city receives them. Now, number four, the public was not prepared because it was never trained. It was never trained. One harsh but necessary truth. Public unpreparedness is not a public failure. It is a government planning failure. Hat Yai residents did not know when to evacuate because they had never been part of evacuation drills. They did not know where emergency shelters were because the system had never clearly designated or communicated them. The severity of this year's flood exceeded recent memory, but that is no excuse. Disaster-prone regions must cultivate a disaster-ready culture, something learned from countries like Japan, where annual drills and community-based preparedness significantly reduce casualties. Thailand must make disaster readiness part of civic life, not an afterthought when water is already at the doorstep. Number five, urban development has made Hat Yai a flood trap. The truth is brutal, but we must admit it. Hat Yai has built itself into a basin with almost no absorptive capacity. Unregulated construction has overtaken natural waterways. Roads act as barriers rather than conduits for water. Buildings have crept onto wetlands, narrowing the channels that once protected the city. Hat Yai now depends almost entirely on two drainage systems, the Utapao Canal and the R1 channel. When both reached capacity, the city had no backup. It was a predictable bottleneck, and it failed exactly as hydrologists have long warned it would. Urban planning must catch up with hydrological reality, or Hat Yai will drown again. Now, where do we go from here? Reforms that must be undertaken include decentralized disaster command, empower provinces, make flood management a national agenda, build a warning system people trust and can act on, integrate water planning with urban planning, and finally, prepare the public, not just the government. Prepare the public, not just the government. And last but not least, provide psychological recovery, not just physical assistance. In conclusion, the water will rise again. Will Thailand rise with it? Hat Yai's flood is not an isolated tragedy. It is a preview. Climate change will make storms more intense, rainfall more concentrated, and flooding more dangerous. Thailand can no longer rely on improvisation, last-minute orders, or hopeful assumptions based on past events. The water will return. The question is whether Thailand will meet it with chaos or with readiness. The answer depends on whether today's painful lessons become tomorrow's policy, or whether they drown once again in the flood waters of complacency. That's a very, very important and timely warning. Thank you for following Suthichai Live. Until the next episode, bye-bye.